My wedding inside the Amish community was postponed 3 separate times, and the true reason for those delays only became clear to me when the fourth date finally arrived. That final date was scheduled for October 18, 1986. Long before the sun came up, our family kitchen was filled with the scents of fresh coffee, rising yeast, and the sweet cinnamon cakes my aunts had prepared in the dark hours before dawn. My bridal gown hung safely behind the pantry door, shielded by a clean white sheet to prevent anyone from accidentally marking it. I had reached 21 years of age. Within 6 hours, I was meant to pledge my life to Daniel Kaufman. Yet rather than assisting me with the fastenings of my dress, my mother stood silently at the kitchen sink, running water over the exact same clean plate over and over again. My father had closeted himself inside the tiny office where he maintained the congregation's official documents. Daniel and his relatives had not yet appeared, and hidden safely beneath my bedding was a creased piece of paper proving that those first 3 postponements had been calculated choices rather than mere coincidences. I was fully aware that presenting this document to the bishop would utterly ruin my family's standing within our church district. I also recognized that if I chose to stay quiet, another woman's existence would be completely buried just so my own life could go forward. At 8 o'clock exactly, a knock echoed at our front door. My mother froze, leaving the plate in the water. My father stepped out of his office, and in that moment, I realized that this fourth wedding date had never actually been set for my benefit. To make sense of how I arrived at that morning, I have to look back to the very first date, back when I still viewed delays as nothing more than lessons in patience. My upbringing took place within a traditional farming district located in northern Indiana, inside a home constructed by my grandfather right next to a slender creek. Our particular community adhered to a strict way of life, even when compared to the neighboring settlements. Expressing personal desires was not something we practiced. Instead, our conversations centered on utility, propriety, and meeting expectations. My father, Samuel Yoder, held a position of high regard among our neighbors because he was a man who rarely spoke with anger. He carried out the duties of a church deacon and took charge of the district's official records. Members of the community regularly sought his counsel regarding property boundaries, household debts, and marital agreements. He possessed a unique talent for steering outcomes so smoothly that it seemed as though no deliberate choice had ever been made at all. My mother, Ruth, possessed a more gentle nature, but she had learned that the easiest way to navigate life was to offer her agreement before anyone could even finish their thought. Being the eldest daughter, I had mastered the skills of running a household by the time I turned 19. I could piece together a dress without relying on a manufactured pattern, store enough winter provisions to sustain us, and maintain quiet among the smaller children during long church services. In our world, those capabilities were the true indicators that a young woman was prepared for marriage. Daniel Kaufman began coming to our home during the summer months of 1984. Being 5 years older than me, he made his living constructing cabinetry alongside his uncle. He was a reserved individual, broadly built, and showed great precision when working with his hands. He stood apart from many of the other young men because he never engaged in loud teasing with girls or tried to display his status through his horses. Whenever he conversed with me, he maintained steady eye contact, which felt a great deal like genuine kindness. At 19, I failed to see the difference between being noticed and truly being understood. Daniel's mother had passed away during his childhood, and his father, Amos, had later married a woman named Lydia, who was a mere 12 years older than Daniel himself. Having no children of her own, Lydia directed their home with an intense focus on order. She frequently accompanied Daniel on his visits to our house, using the time to look over our garden, sample my baked goods, and observe the speed of my chores. On one particular afternoon, she lifted the corner of a quilt I was working on, turning it over to check the quality of the stitching underneath. She remarked that it was tidy work, noting that a home always reveals the true character of the woman running it. I offered a smile, believing her words were a sign of acceptance. Right then, my mother accidentally dropped a utensil into a dish. The noise was quiet, but it stayed with me because she refused to look up after it happened. Daniel and I were only permitted to converse without supervision in places where we could be easily seen. We would sit out on the porch while our families stayed within earshot, ensuring our voices never rose too high. After our Sunday church meetings, we would walk along the edge of the road together. During one of these walks across an open pasture, he inquired whether I hoped to raise a large family. I replied that I would welcome as many children as were provided, offering the exact response I had been raised to give. He simply nodded at my answer. Then he pressed further, asking how I would feel if no children came at all. The thought had truly never entered my mind, so I told him I believed that would simply be a reflection of the Lord's will. He turned his gaze toward the distant trees and noted that everyone seemed to give that exact same answer. I missed the underlying sorrow in his tone back then. Our formal arrangement to marry was never declared with any sort of public celebration. Instead, my father approached me one evening to explain that Daniel's family had come forward with a formal proposal, and both households agreed that we were a proper match. He never once inquired about my deeper feelings for Daniel. In our corner of the world, affection was something expected to develop naturally out of shared duty, mutual work, and the passage of time. I held a deep desire to make my parents proud, and I also looked forward to having a household of my own where I might be viewed as an adult rather than just the oldest child expected to serve everyone else. Because of that, I gave my consent. The initial date for our ceremony was set for November 6, 1985. For weeks leading up to it, women gathered at our home to get the food ready. My mother and I spent our time sewing my wedding outfit, which was a deep shade of blue, as white gowns were not part of our community's traditions. It was a simple design, tailored closely at the waist with long sleeves and small, concealed fasteners tucked beneath the front fabric. My mother did the vast majority of the sewing in complete silence. Just 3 days prior to the wedding, I discovered she had integrated a very narrow, hidden pocket deep within the folds of the skirt. When I asked about its purpose, she gently rubbed her fingers over the stitching and remarked that there are times when a woman must keep things close that no one else has a right to look at. I let out a soft laugh, assuming she was referring to something simple like a handkerchief or a private note, but her face remained entirely serious. The very night before we were supposed to marry, Daniel's father arrived at our house long after darkness had fallen. I could hear the murmur of men conversing inside my father's private office. Though they kept their volume low, the sound traveled through the floorboards up to my room, allowing me to catch specific phrases like, "Not yet," "Someone is asking questions," and "The documentation requires correction." Soon after, I heard my father declare that the following day could not go forward. I sat frozen on the edge of my mattress in my nightclothes, gripping one of the blue sleeves I had yet to smooth out with the iron. My mother walked into my room without tapping on the door first. She informed me that a dispute had come up between the Kaufman family and our bishop, meaning the wedding would have to be put off until the spring season. When I pushed her for details on what they were arguing about, she explained it was a matter regarding property. I asked which land was involved, and she took the fabric from my hands, folding it while telling me it was nothing that concerned my own life. By the time breakfast was served the next morning, the entire district had been informed that Daniel's father had uncovered an error regarding a property line. Nobody placed any fault on me. Our neighbors simply remarked that these kinds of complications happen from time to time. They comforted me by saying it was far better for a marriage to start without any lingering friction between the two families. Daniel came by to see me 2 days after the cancellation. He looked weighed down by embarrassment, though he maintained that the delay had absolutely nothing to do with our relationship. He explained that his father believed the boundary lines had been recorded inaccurately following his grandfather's passing. When I asked why the mistake hadn't been noticed sooner, he offered no clear answer. I then asked if he had heard the men discussing a record that needed correcting, and he avoided my gaze entirely, muttering that there are countless records kept in the district. That was the very first sign that something was amiss, but it was small enough that I allowed myself to overlook it, choosing instead to focus on the brief moment he held my hand before he departed. Our second wedding date was chosen for May 14, 1986. By that point, the property boundary issue had supposedly been cleared up entirely. The spring crops were nearly all in the ground, and both of our families were anxious to see the marriage completed before the intense labor of the summer months overtook us. However, Daniel's demeanor shifted noticeably during that intervening period. He kept up his visits, but he grew incredibly guarded whenever certain topics were raised. If I brought up the logistics of the wedding day, his responses were minimal. When I inquired about where we would establish our home, he confessed that his father had yet to determine if we would move into the vacant tenant house or simply build additional rooms onto the main Kaufman home. I told him plainly one evening that my preference was the tenant house, noting that since it had been unoccupied for so long, we would have the opportunity to make it truly our own. His face darkened at my words, and he mentioned that Lydia wanted us to remain close to the rest of the family. I responded sharply that Lydia wasn't the person he was marrying. I had never spoken to him with such edge before. He kept his eyes fixed on the dirt, warning me that it would be a mistake to make an enemy out of her. His tone caused a wave of fear to wash over me, far more than if he had simply lost his temper. When I pressed him on why she would ever view me as an enemy, he claimed I was reading too much into his words. A week later, Lydia arrived at our kitchen to assist my mother with putting up fruit preserves. She brought along a small sewing box crafted from walnut wood, lined inside with a faded green material, presenting it as a wedding present. When I offered my gratitude, she casually mentioned that the box had originally belonged to the girl Daniel was first intended to marry. A heavy stillness settled over the entire kitchen. I stood there wondering if I had somehow misheard her words. When I repeated the phrase, Lydia's expression barely shifted as she described it as a childhood arrangement that had never become official. My mother turned her back to us completely, focusing entirely on scrubbing the surface of the stovetop. The next time Daniel came to visit, I confronted him about what Lydia had said. He explained that the girl was named Anna Miller, and that their fathers had once discussed a future match between them, but the entire family had relocated to Ohio before any formal agreement could be established. I asked why he had never once brought her up to me, and he insisted it was because the matter amounted to nothing at all. When I asked if he had cared for her, he hesitated for a long beat before answering that they had simply been young. A vague statement like that could hide almost any truth. Part of me wanted to know if Anna had actually used that green-lined box, and why Lydia had kept it all this time, but I chose to soothe my own mind by rationalizing that every family has a past that predates an engagement. Just 2 days prior to that second wedding date, our bishop arrived at our home. Bishop Eli Beer was a broadly built man with exceptionally pale eyebrows and a habit of speaking in an increasingly soft whisper whenever he was unhappy. He sat down with my father in our front room while my mother and I kept to the kitchen. After nearly an hour had passed, my father called me into the room. The bishop informed me that the ceremony could not take place that week because certain questions had been raised regarding Daniel's standing with the church. When I demanded to know what those questions were, he folded his hands across his middle and stated that Daniel had failed to make a full confession regarding an act of disobedience from his youth. Daniel had taken his baptismal vows at 18, and a serious, unconfessed transgression could halt a marriage until the issue was thoroughly resolved by the church leadership. I asked what exactly he was accused of doing, but the bishop told me the matter remained strictly between Daniel and the ministers. I questioned how it could be private if it directly halted my own wedding day, causing my father's face to shift into an expression of stern warning. The bishop looked at me and remarked that a wife must understand she does not hold a right to know every single matter involving her husband. Though we weren't wed yet, I knew to look down and accept the rebuke. The ceremony was put off once more, this time until the end of summer, and the postponement set off a wave of rumors throughout the district. Certain neighbors whispered that Daniel had taken part in forbidden youth gatherings, while others claimed he had been caught utilizing a telephone without authorization. One individual even suggested to my aunt that Daniel might have spent a period living out among the English people before choosing to return to the church community. Yet none of those explanations seemed to account for the deep, palpable terror I could see in my mother's eyes. Driven by desperation, I went to Daniel's workshop without asking for permission. The interior was thick with the scent of freshly sawn oak, and motes of dust drifted through the streams of sunlight by the open entryway. Daniel was in the middle of smoothing down a cabinet door when I walked in. I demanded to know exactly what he had done, telling him I could handle the public shame, but I could not handle being kept in the dark. He ceased his movements and wiped his hands with deliberate slowness. He confessed that a promise had been made prior to his commitment to me, admitting it was a promise made to Anna. When I pushed him to explain what he had promised, he looked toward the back storage area and insisted he couldn't share the details just yet. I asked point blank if he had promised her marriage, which caused his jaw to visibly tighten as he remarked that the situation was far more tangled than that. I asked if his heart still belonged to her, and he fired back a denial far too quickly to be believable. When I asked why he couldn't just be honest with me then, he muttered that the situation didn't just affect him alone. He moved closer to me, lowering his voice to tell me I should let the church leadership handle a matter they truly understood. That moment marked the very first time I recognized that something essential was being stripped away from me, not just the wedding day itself, but my fundamental right to understand the course of my own life. I turned and walked out of the shop without uttering another word. Our third wedding date was designated for August 27th, leaving a mere 7 weeks to prepare. My father's patience completely wore thin whenever I tried to ask questions about it. He pointed out that these continuous delays had already severely damaged the reputations of both households, and he reminded me that Daniel had stayed entirely dedicated to our match, despite facing massive public embarrassment. Dedicated was the specific term everyone kept repeating, though no one seemed willing to wonder if dedication built on top of a lie was actually a good thing. 3 weeks before the ceremony was to take place, I walked behind our wash house and discovered my mother burning papers. The afternoon heat was heavy, and the air was thick with the combined smells of lye soap, burning wood, and morning dew on the grass. She was standing directly over a small metal tub, dropping sheets of paper into the flames one by one. The moment her eyes met mine, she shifted her body to block my view of the fire. When I asked what she was doing, she claimed she was merely clearing out old household financial records. I knew my father would never permit financial documents to be destroyed like that, so I reached past her with a fallen branch and managed to hook a partially scorched page out of the basin. The edges of the paper were glowing orange with fire as I stamped them out in the dirt. Only a tiny fraction of the writing was still readable. I could make out the name Anna Miller, a specific date from the year 1983, and right below those details, the phrase, "child placed." My mother lunged forward to grab the scrap, but I held my grip tight, demanding to know what child they were talking about. The color drained from her face completely, as she insisted it wasn't my concern. I countered that everyone kept using that exact phrase with me. She glanced nervously back toward our house, lowered her volume, and remarked that there are some truths in this life that will do nothing but destroy the person who uncovers them. I looked at her and asked directly if Anna had given birth to Daniel's child, and the way she closed her eyes tightly served as all the confirmation I required. She snatched the burnt scrap from my fingers and tossed it back into the flames, leaving me to stand there watching Anna's name dissolve into black flakes. That very evening, I confronted Daniel out by the side of the barn. He didn't attempt to deny that Anna had delivered a child, though he claimed the infant hadn't survived. I asked him directly if the baby was his, and he looked at me before pushing past, admitting that Anna had claimed it.